Good evening, everyone. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, students. My name is Luisa Białasiewicz, and as the academic co-director of ACES, the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, I wanted to welcome you to tonight's event. And thank you very much for joining us for this discussion, which is co-organized by ACES and SPOW25, as part of an ongoing series that we've been running for 2 years now called Visions of Europe. And tonight we're very fortunate, I think, to have as part of the series someone who for almost 2 decades now has been contributing to shaping Visions of Europe, both in his own work and writing, but also as the co-founder and director of the first pan-European think tank, the European Council on Foreign Relations, Mark Leonard. And I just wanted to say it's very nice to co-organize an event with the ECFR almost a year to the date of our previous event in December 2020, when we had a very interesting discussion about questions of European solidarity in the pandemic. So it's nice to be back, as I said, a year later. So Mark will probably need very little introduction to most of you. Certainly one of the most prolific and prominent commentators on both global and European affairs. And apart from his frequent media appearances, he's also the author of a number of books that many of you will have read, and books that in all sorts of ways set the tone for discussions regarding the EU's role in a changing world. Beginning in 2005, with his first book, Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century, published in 2005 and translated into 19 languages, followed by a book on China, What Does China Think, in 2008. He's here today with us to share his thoughts on his latest book, entitled The Age of Unpeace, How Connectivity Causes Conflict, and it's a book that just came out this autumn. We're also very fortunate to have with us as a discussant Thijs van der Plas, who is currently Director General for Political Affairs of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and previously the ministry's Director General for European Cooperation. Before that, Thijs also held a number of diplomatic positions, including postings at the Dutch embassies in Ankara, in Sofia, with NATO, and with the Netherlands' permanent representation to the EU. So definitely an ideal person to comment on the EU's shifting geopolitical role. So thank you very much, Thijs, for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us tonight. So before I pass the floor to Mark, I just wanted to give you a sense of the structure of the evening tonight. So Mark will speak for about 25-30 minutes or so. We will then turn over to Thijs for a comment of about 10 minutes. We'll let Mark respond, and then we will open the floor to you. So in the audience, we would encourage you to submit your questions either via the Q&A button. Those of you who are following us through the live stream on YouTube, you are also able to submit your questions there. We will see if it is possible to let you ask your questions live. This is a new kind of function of our webinars that we're still kind of trying to play with. So hopefully that will be possible. And we hope that you will participate actively in this discussion. So before I turn it over to you, Mark, I wanted to start us off with a question that likely many of us familiar with your work will have in our mind. Thinking of your 2005 book, so Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century, you painted a very different picture, both of the geopolitical state of the world, but also of Europe's role there. And the book came out in what was certainly a very kind of Euro-enthusiastic moment when the EU was beginning for the first time kind of explicitly to articulate its geopolitical role. In many ways, very much in distinction to George Bush's neoconservative policies. And in fact, kind of quite distinct to the neoconservative visions of, kind of America's necessary hard power in this dangerous Hobbesian world, what you called Europe's power and weakness was different, as you wrote, because it couldn't be measured only in military spending, but it was a transformative power. And I think, certainly our students who are listening in will be very well familiar with these debates. So it was a power that worked in the long term and was especially based on the EU's connections with the rest of the world through its various engagements, whether political engagements, economic, cultural. So, what you called its power of attraction. And I think it was a very compelling alternative vision of and for Europe. It certainly was very compelling to me. And one that I think shaped quite profoundly the EU's self-representation as a geopolitical actor in the years to come. And I think we can see echoes of that even in the EU's global strategy that comes out in 2016. So I guess the question, that many of us will have is, what's changed in the past 15 years? How has Europe's power of attraction become a potential Achilles heel? Why is its relational power, its power of connectivity, possibly now a problem rather than an advantage? I mean, is it the world that has changed, the EU that has changed, or both? I mean, I know, you give some very compelling answers in the book, so we'll be very curious to hear more tonight. So I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Louisa, for your lovely introduction and for inviting me to take part in this wonderful event. You asked some quite profound questions there, which in fact is what my book has been trying to answer. It's like, how come somebody who's optimistic, who's an internationalist like me, seems to be trapped in a world that has many of the key turns in the last decade or so seem to favor pessimists. I'm going to, rather than answering it at the beginning, I'll try and answer it through my talk, which in a way is about the intellectual journey that I've been on, particularly over the last 5 years after 2016. And this book starts in quite a dark place, as many of the things that I hoped would happen in the world seem to be running into the buffers of a different kind of reality. But I think it ends in a more optimistic place. And I'm going to try and take you on this journey, which I've been through, which has led me to re-examine quite a lot of my assumptions about how the world worked, but also to rethink the role of the European project in this world. I've got some slides which I hope I can share with you, and going to start really with this slide, which is the big geopolitical story which many people were focused on in the summer. And this image is a particularly heart-rending image. It's an image of Afghans clambering onto a US plane as it takes off from Hamid Karzai International Airport. And what you can see from the brutal way that the bodies were cast off is both President Biden's determination to end the forever wars. But I think one of the reasons why that picture was so poignant is that it wasn't just a human tragedy for the Afghans who were being thrown off the plane, but there was also a sense that something else was left behind on the runway of Hamid Karzai International Airport. And that was a more optimistic era where the West thought that it was building a liberal international order, that it could spread democracy in its wake to different parts of the world. And that image, I think, might come to be seen as a turning point in geopolitics, the end of the post-Cold War era and the start of a new world. The hope of President Biden was that this would be the end of the forever wars. But what I'm trying to talk about tonight is why, and what my book is about, is that the end of the forever wars isn't necessarily going to bring forever peace. In fact, in many ways, it's going to be just the opposite. And to understand why that is, I think we should look at some of the other big stories that have been dominating the news over the last couple of years, stories which show a different way of thinking about international relations. I'm going to start with the most obvious one with COVID. And when the crisis first struck, many people thought that this would be something which would bring the world together, that humanity would be united in its quest to push back against this deadly virus. But instead, what we've seen in many cases, instead of global cooperation, is mass diplomacy, vaccine nationalism, an attempt by different countries to use their control of scarce resources to advance their own interests and to punish others. The next slide is another kind of very poignant moment over the last couple of years, and it shows that the toxic connections that we have aren't just to do with illness and with disease, but go right to the heart of our politics. This is an image of the Black Lives Matter protests, which raged in the United States of America after George Floyd was murdered. And there's a very interesting moment where you had a powerful wave of social media posts from Africa calling for violence against the fascist police in inverted commas. And it looked like a global political awakening. It was only later on that people realized that it was orchestrated by troll factories in Ghana and Nigeria, which were funded by the Russian state. It's another image of one of the big geopolitical stories of the last couple of years, the conflict over technology. Google and Huawei had worked very closely together for many years, building a partnership between the most successful handset maker and the most widely used operating system. But when America put the Chinese handset maker on a banned list, Google immediately banned Huawei from its Android platform, and it left millions of people unable to update their phones. It plunged China's tech giant into crisis, and it started a sort of spiral of decoupling, which could change the face of global technology and knowledge and have a big impact on global supply chains. This is a picture of British supermarkets. It shows that even allies can end up at loggerheads with each other. This is a picture from December 2020 when British supermarkets ran out of fruit and vegetables because the French government decided to close its borders to truckers. The ban on British lorries was ostensibly about controlling COVID, but the way it was read in the British media and in Downing Street was much more to do with the end game of the Brexit negotiations. And this was seen as a way of putting pressure on the British government around those issues. This is a picture of an Iranian ship, and it's a ship, an army ship that was involved in kidnapping a South Korean tanker. It was part of a series of different moves by the Iranian Navy in the Strait of Hormuz, which were trying to actually push back themselves against the crippling sanctions which the United States and the West had imposed on Iran. So this piracy was designed to break a financial blockade. This is a picture of the Turkish border with Greece. I could have put a picture even more recently of the Belarusian border with Poland. In this picture, the Turkish president opened his country border to Greece and urged lots of Syrian refugees to go across it to seek a better life in Europe. His goal wasn't really to help them follow their dreams, but rather to use the threat of a wave of refugees to extort concessions from the European Union. And it's a tactic which we've seen President Lukashenko in Belarus trying to repeat with a simulacrum of the refugee crisis, a mini simulacrum of the refugee crisis in 2015. This is a picture of the Amazon rainforest burning. Many people see pictures like that and are confirmed in their mind that the world needs to come together to tackle climate change. Unfortunately, the Brazilian president Bolsonaro isn't one of them. Instead, he uses, and his government has used, concerns of others to try and extort money from the international community, demanding large payments in order to reduce the clearance of Brazilian forests. So what do these kind of pictures have in common? Chinese bullying over masks, Russian trolling, American regulation, French blockades, Iranian piracy, Turkish or Belarusian border policy, and Brazilian blackmail. The main thing they have in common is that they're not random accidents like an asteroid falling from the sky or an earthquake, but they're new types of political violence. Each was a weapon that was perfectly evolved to exploit a weakness in our connected world. And each time one country uses one of these tools, another reciprocates. And there's a danger that we could see a deadly spiral of tensions spread across the world, spreading, like a virus. And the book which I've written, The Age of Unpeace, is a short volume with a very simple idea, which is that the connections that knit the world together are also driving it apart. My argument is that at a time when war between nuclear powers is so dangerous that few countries are even willing to contemplate it, great powers are waging conflict with each other by manipulating the very things which link them together. And this is a very painful thing for us to confront, particularly as Europeans. Louisa mentioned my book on Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century, which was a celebration of interdependence. It's something which comes from both from my sort of intellectual development, but also from my personal development. I'm the child of a German Jewish mother and a British father who grew up in Brussels. And I've seen all sorts of advantages in my life that come about from the ways that the world has been knitted together by creating interdependence. We've seen literally how, starting with coal and steel, spreading to a common market, going out towards a single currency, enemies have been turned into friends within the European space. And there was a huge amount of hope that this model could actually be universalized to cover the whole planet. But 2016 forced many people to reevaluate these ideas, both because of the Brexit referendum in the UK, the election of Donald Trump in America, and made us sort of think about geopolitics in a different way. Because even though the conventional wisdom is that we live in an era of great power peace, hiding below the surface of that, as my first slide showed, I think we can see a huge amount of tension and violence ripping through the world every day. And we don't really have a way of thinking about it, of capturing it, or even describing it. And the reason I called my book The Age of Unpeace is because I was looking for a word that captures this liminal condition, suspended somehow between a state of war and peace. And academics like Lucas Kello, who work on cyber, who wanted to describe the gray zone in which their world was immersed, where every day you see millions of attacks that fall short of conventional war, rehabilitated this beautiful Anglo-Saxon word, unpeace. And I think as violence spreads from the weaponization of the internet to all facets of globalization, the word provides a perfect encapsulation of our condition. We are becoming familiar with an unstable, crisis-prone world of perpetual competition and endless attacks between competing powers. So welcome to the Age of Unpeace. In the Age of Unpeace, great power politics has become like a loveless marriage, where the couple can't stand each other's company, but they're unable to get divorced. And as with an unhappy couple, it's the things that we share during the good times that have become the means that we use to harm each other during the bad ones. In a collapsing marriage, the vindictive partners use who gets control of the holiday home, the dog, the children, to hurt one another. But in geopolitics, there are a different set of battlegrounds. In fact, they're all the things that were meant to bring us together. The infrastructure of globalization, dealing with global health questions, the economy and finance, migration, technology, the internet, all of the different things which we were told would unite the world have now become battlegrounds in geopolitics, and in their own ways are being used to drive it apart. And I'm just going to run through some of these battlegrounds quickly before talking about what it means for how we think about peace and about geopolitics and about projects like the European Union, which Louisa asked me about at the beginning. So the economics and finance battleground is the most kind of dramatic one. Countries are using the threat of sanctions, boycotts, export controls, import bans for political goals. This slide shows a few of those examples, from China's threat of introducing car tariffs to pressure Germany into accepting Huawei's 5G infrastructure, or the Turkish boycott of French labeled goods following President Macron's announcement of new policies for fighting extremism. Second slide is health. As I said, it should bring the planet together, but instead we've had mass diplomacy, vaccine nationalism. This map shows that 98 countries were in fact active on the health battlefield, introducing export restrictions or bans on particular products. This slide shows how global infrastructure, the pipelines, roads, 5G cable networks, 5G networks, fiber optic cable networks, ports, the things which put the world together are increasingly being seen as a currency of power. This is a map of the Belt and Road Initiative, which China is using to link its economy to 65 countries around the world. And many people fear that it's trying to do that by putting itself at the heart of a new set of bilateral relationships, which increase its political power by making other countries dependent on it. Another battleground is technology, which is not simply about who sets the standards for the most advanced technological tools of the 21st century. It has a lot to do with the future of knowledge, whether it's balkanized or whether we can have international science, but also has a lot to do with the freedom of our societies and democracy. This map shows how in the decade from over the last decade, there have been 41 elections and 7 referenda which have been interfered with in cyber operations and online information campaigns. The next slide shows that even climate has become a battlefield. We thought that we were all in the same boat, but there are lots of people who are trying to introduce measures to extract advantage from the carbon transition that the world is going through. And even when countries do things which they think are indubitably about saving humanity, such as the European Union, when it talks about introducing a carbon border adjustment mechanism, many other players think that this is about protectionism and has very little to do with real environmental credentials. I mentioned earlier the example of migration, which has been much in the news on the Belarusian-Polish border and in our relations with Turkey. But those are just some of the most recent examples. There have been, according to academics like Kelly Greenhill, 75 cases of countries using weapons of mass migration in the last few decades, which have been sort of devastatingly effective. In my book, I sort of try and look at how different players are operating in this world and show how though the idea of manipulating interdependence isn't new, you can go back as far as the Peloponnesian Wars to see sanctions in action between different countries. What is new is the dense network of connections that form the hidden wiring of our globalized world, and the ways that gives sanctions, blockades, PR campaigns a viral quality and deadliness that didn't exist before our world was defined by networks. Although the journalist Thomas Friedman told us that the globalized world is flat, the reality is that it's the exact opposite. It's very uneven and mountainous. Some countries are more central to the system than others. They can cut rival nations off and use their control of hubs to assert their power. I'm not going to go into detail about the different tactics that countries are using. You have lots of different players that are involved in it. But one of the things that I think is striking about this new world is that it has a different shape to earlier world orders. Many people have said that we have got to the end of the unipolar world, which was established after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we are entering a kind of new order. The most common description of where we are at the moment is that we are entering a new bipolar world, where China and the US are becoming the new avatars of open and closed societies, or closed and open societies, and that this somehow echoes the Cold War that existed before 1991. I think this is a very unhelpful way of understanding where we're at the moment. Firstly, because it hides the extent to which our world is a product of hyper connectivity, which is behind all of these attempts to weaponize globalization, which I've described before. But also, it, I think, takes agency away from some of the other players in the world. And I think a better way of understanding where we're at the moment is as a four world order, where you have three empires of connectivity with fundamentally different ideas about how to organize the planet. And I think they are the US and China, but also the European Union. And I think all three of them have got quite different ways of thinking about connections. The US mainly as a sort of gatekeeper that focuses on the hubs in the network and explores how it can use them either to shut countries in and out of the global financial system or to put them under surveillance. And then you have China that is has been described by Chinese thinkers as a relational power that focuses not at the hubs, but on the ties between different countries and looks at how they're structured. And the whole idea of the Belt and Road Initiative is a modern manifestation of an ancient Chinese dream of being the Middle Kingdom that manages its relationships around it in new ways. And the European Union looks at the world very differently. It doesn't look either at the hubs or at the ties, but thinks more about the operating system of our global networks. And in that sense is a rule-making power that's trying to kind of order the world in different ways. But all around those three powers are most of the people who live in the world, who don't live in China, the US, and the European Union. I call that the fourth world. And people in those countries are very scared of being forced to follow the diktats from the big three empires of connectivity and being forced to choose between them. But they can also find new ways of exerting themselves. And there are lots of niche techniques, whether it's about Russia becoming a pioneer of societal disruption through its election interference and its gas cutoffs, or Turkey and Belarus weaponizing migration, or the ways that Saudi Arabia and Iran are reaching out to Shia and Sunni communities and using connectivity in very creative ways in their neighborhood. I think if we look forward at geopolitics, some of the biggest dangers are going to come from when these systems in the four world order clash with each other, which could create a whole series of new flashpoints. As I said, this is a book that came from quite a dark place, as I saw many people experiencing the things which I thought of as huge civilizational advances in Europe in very, very different ways. And they saw it as making them feel more vulnerable and more unsafe than before. But the book does kind of end in a more hopeful place as well, but not the place I thought it was going to end in. When I first started writing the book, I thought that I was going to be writing a passionate plea for an open world. I hoped to design a new architecture for a more united planet. But the deeper I delved, the more I became aware that the good and the bad features of connectivity are inextricably entwined, and that it's impossible to untangle them without destroying many of the things that have allowed our civilization to leap forward in recent decades. And I was struggling very much with this problem until I had an epiphany about the dilemma facing our world during one of my many trips to Beijing. And I was browsing in my favorite bookshop there, which I think has since gone bust, the Bookworm, when I came across a volume called Facing Codependence by Pia Mellody, which seemed to capture all of the pathologies that beset contemporary politics and international relations. And rather than talking about it as about interdependence as a balance phenomenon, what this book did was identified a condition called codependence, during which the ties between different players become toxic, but also inescapable. And Melody's diagnosis of our condition is rooted not in the pathology of individual countries, but in the nature of the relationships between them. It recognizes that many of the tensions stem as much from psychology as from economics. It sees these tensions as being intrinsic to the global system that we've created, and therefore can only be managed and channeled, but not eliminated. But most importantly, it starts with the lived reality of ordinary people rather than the theories of experts, and basically takes the fears which people have seriously and tries to find ways of making them feel safer rather than telling them that they're mistaken in their fears. The only big surprise I had when I was looking this book and devouring it was where I found it. And what I discovered was that rather than it being located in the international politics section of the bookshop, it was in the self-help section. And that's really kind of where I want to end, because what I realized when I looked at Melody's book was that the world needs therapists rather than architects. If we can't hope to get rid of the dark side of connectivity with a new grand design, what we need are strategies for shaping and surviving our new reality. During the Cold War, people realized that the biggest threats to humanity was the nuclear arms race that could spiral out of control, and they tried to use the escalation to build trust and gradually bring the weapons that threaten to wipe out humanity under control. Our own dilemma is much more complex, because the big threats to our peace aren't simply a few technologies which can be locked up and counted and inspected, because almost everything can be weaponized today. So if the connections that are essential to our well-being are also being turned into deadly weapons, then we need to find ways of making them less dangerous. And I argue that if the Cold War challenge was about arms control, the equivalent for our age is about disarming connectivity. It's a Sisyphean struggle that's a bit like the ongoing therapy that is required to detoxify personal relationships. And during my the conclusion of the book, I tried to set out a 5-step program for the Age of Unpeace, which is based around this idea of disarming connectivity. It starts with the first step, which is of all therapy programs, which is facing up to the problem and looking at what's really going on. I then establish how we can think about bringing in healthy boundaries between countries, because paradoxically, one of the best ways to unite the world is to make people feel that they have enough distance that they are safe and in control. And the dividing line, therefore, in our politics shouldn't be between open and closed, but rather between managed and unmanaged togetherness. And that has a very clear policy agenda in everything from trade and migration policy to technology and cultural change. There's a third step, which is being realistic about what we can control, because one of the big dangers that we have if all the different points of contact between great powers are seen as sites of systemic rivalry. It's very difficult to stop them escalating into a situation of permanent insecurity. And what we need to do instead is to try and transform our competition into something which is tough, but which has rules and limits around it. And that relates to the final two steps, which are about self-care, looking at what we can do ourselves to manage our relationships with other players so that we're not subject to manipulation and to blackmail by other players. And that does mean probably a degree of selective decoupling, as well as investing in resilience through different policies on education, healthcare, technology, industrial policies, etc. And the final step is about seeking real consent. One of the reasons there's so much pushback to interdependence is people have been presented as if we have no choice over these things. Anyway, if you put all of these things together, I think what my book is trying to do is to argue that connectivity, whether we like it or not, is a double-edged sword. And once we accept that, and we can see that it brings conflict to us as well as cooperation, then we can implement strategies that minimize discontent and limit the violence that it brings in its wake. I think the European Union, in many ways, could be the most powerful tool which European citizens have to try and disarm connectivity. It has been a tool for disarming connectivity within our continent, but by organizing ourselves differently, we can actually start to think differently about the relationships that we have with other players. But that is a big psychological change, because for most of the last few decades, the EU has been seen as globalization writ small rather than an attempt to really control it. And as I said at the beginning of my therapy session, that the first with dealing with all psychological malady is to acknowledge that there's a problem. And that's the ultimate purpose of my book. It's an intervention. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mark. I think lots to think about, not just for the EU. And I think, you know, this double dimension that I hope we can come back to of, you know, kind of engaging first, as you said, within, to be able to engage with the external world, I think is very important. I mean, that's always been a facet of geopolitical visions, right? I mean, they're both outward looking, but they also speak to who we are and who we want to be, especially. So hopefully we can, you know, kind of come back to that. But I'd like to give the floor to Thijs to hear your thoughts. So Thijs, on to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? First of all, delighted to be here. I understand there's many students from the University of Amsterdam. About 30 years ago, I was a teacher there in the law faculty before I joined the diplomatic service. So this feels like coming home. And it's great to be in this session with Mark, because he has indeed written an important book. I agree with many of the observations that Mark makes. This is a very well-timed book. It captures the essence of many of the foreign policy dilemmas that land on my desk every day. And I think it's compulsory literature for students of geopolitics and also for diplomats. I have done foreign policy and diplomacy for 30 years now, since I started my career as a desk officer dealing with a classical war, namely the one in former Yugoslavia. And I see three significant shifts from the days I started in the foreign service until now. And those are also dealt with in Mark's book. The world has become more globalized. The world has become more digitalized, and foreign policy as a result of that has become popularized and polarized. So I feel like I play a whole different game these days than I did 30 years ago. Globalization has meant that the threats that were once distant are now very close, and foreign and domestic policy have really become intertwined. And if I look at the last 15 years, what were the major threats to the security and the prosperity of the Kingdom of the Netherlands? They were certainly not military in nature. It was the financial crisis of 2008. It was the migration crisis of 2015. It was the pandemic crisis of last year. And it was cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns, a bit of terrorism, although not to the extent that you saw in France, Spain, Belgium, or the UK, but certainly that. But those were the threats, none of them military in nature. At the same time, let's not forget that war in a traditional sense is still very much with us. It is tempting to think that that is yesterday's world, but it is very much today's world. If I look at the same last 15 years, where all the threats to the Kingdom of the Netherlands were non-military in nature, in those same 15 years, we saw wars and highly kinetic conflicts in Iraq, in Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Georgia, Ukraine, Sahel, Tigray this year. Often not between states, but still very much war as we knew it. It is still, as you said, a dangerous and Hobbesian world out there. And we should not fool ourselves in thinking that those days are over on the European continent. They might not. And we need an insurance policy for that. And luckily, we have that in NATO. So we do need to be prepared for these new challenges, but also for the old security threats. What does that mean for Europe? It means that Europe needs to become geopolitical. That's what everybody said. Ursula von der Leyen, on her first day, said we will be a geopolitical commission. Previously, the Juncker Commission was a political commission. We really didn't like that. Because that meant giving freebies to countries who didn't adhere to the rules of the monetary union. The geopolitical commission is already an improvement. But what is it? What is a geopolitical European Union? I don't have the answer to that. I do see manifestations of it. And what I define as acting in a geopolitical sense is to use all the instruments that you have at your disposal in an integrated way to achieve a goal. And the best example I have seen of that in the European Union, and I was closely involved in that, was the migration deal that we struck with Turkey. That was under the Dutch presidency. It was Angela Merkel, my Prime Minister Mark Rutte, together with the then Turkish Prime Minister Davutoglu, and we struck this deal. And in the deal, we used all the instruments that we had at our disposal. We used money. We gave them billions. We used trade. We promised the modernization of the customs union. We used freedom of movement. We said you will get visa liberalization. We used the lure of enlargement. We said we will kickstart the accession process again. So we used, in that deal, you will find all the instruments that the EU has. EU doesn't have military instruments, or not very significant, but everything else we used in that deal, and it worked. We achieved a goal. We stemmed the uncontrollable migration influx. So that is what Europe is in a geopolitical sense. I spent actually most of my career in what we used to call the first and third pillar of the Union. So the hard stuff, the nuts and bolts, and the EU has an impressive track record when it comes to that. We built an internal market, a monetary union, Schengen. We constructed the justice and home affairs space. We are very good at creating a climate policy. All of that we're brilliant at. And why is that? Because it's all rule-based. And that's what we're good at. Because the EU is a community of values, but in its elaboration, it's a legal construct. It is a rules-based community. That is the essence of what we do, and that is why it's also so quintessential what is now happening in the conflict between the Commission and the Court of Justice on the one side, and several European member states on the other side, because that is about the legality of the project, the primacy of EU laws being put in question there. So it's a very threatening development from within. Now, since 3 years, I've been Director General Political Affairs, and I deal with what we used to call the second pillar, the foreign policy aspect of the EU. And I find that the achievements of the European Union in that field are far less impressive. It is very underwhelming, actually. And what I find is that in the EU, we have a tendency to export our rules-based model. We want the rest of the world to be like us. And we think that's going to work. But in fact, it's not. Because as you said, it's a dangerous Hobbesian world out there. And our approach that we use internally does not work. So what we need is robust defenses, not only military, but also in the cyber domain, in advanced technology, in constructing integrated value chains that are resilient, in making sure that we don't have dependencies that can be weaponized against us, in making sure that countries around us cannot mess with our elections or with our democratic institutions. This is what Mark calls, I think, disarming connectivity, and I agree with that. That's what we need to do. I see the European Union maturing in that, but not very rapidly. We are making baby steps. So we have an instrument to screen foreign investments. And we are slowly protecting advanced technology. We are securing that we have a safe 5G infrastructure. We're defending more and more against cyber attacks, but it's baby steps. Does not nearly go as fast as it should go. And there's very often national prerogatives there that are invoked. With the internal market, we gave all that up. In this domain, it's very difficult. When I became Director General Political Affairs, also the first meeting with all my colleagues I went to, we meet every 6 months now at the beginning of a new presidency. So we'll be meeting somewhere in France in January. I said, isn't it about time we abolish the unanimity rule in foreign policy? Because I've been dealing for the last 10 years with the monetary union and the internal market, and there we've abolished it a long time ago. And the interests at stake there are very big, and yet everybody's comfortable doing that. And all other 26 political directors looked at me and said, no, we'll never do that in foreign policy. But it is interesting to read the German coalition agreement because now Germany is on board for this. So that's promising. One thing, which struck me in Mark's book and also what he said is the importance of borders. And I couldn't agree more, having lived through the migration crisis of 2015 and 2016. And the EU is always about abolishing borders. But our citizens want borders. Not the students of international relations at the University of Amsterdam, because I know that crowd. They're fine with openness and no borders. But the average citizen in the average European country wants borders, finds the borders very important. And I mean the borders of their own country. And to protect those borders, who do they look at? Not at Brussels. They look at their own government. And governments have a duty to protect borders. Also, the government of Poland right now, when the integrity of their border is being jeopardized by a hybrid operation by Lukashenko. So let's not forget, borders are there to protect, and citizens want that. Then about Mark's remarks on the connectivity hyperpowers, China, the US, and the EU. I agree, those are three very important powers, but I would say don't forget Russia. It doesn't have a significant economy. It's the size of, now even smaller than Italy, I think, and it's very carbon dependent. So in the future, it's going to get even smaller. But Russia is still a power to reckon with. It is a major threat, also in the new domains. I sit in on Security Council meetings here in the Netherlands, and weekly get briefed on the next cyber attacks emanating from Russia. Russia does disinformation campaigns, Russia meddles in elections, but Russia is also very strong in the classic domains, in Libya, in Syria, with Wagner, in the Central African Republic, now maybe in Mali. And look at what is happening now at the Ukrainian border. So I would say, don't forget Russia. And what is actually happening now at the Ukrainian border, I find again, the European reaction to it is also instructive. In a sense, it tells you something about our geopolitical capacity, because Europe now is divided over what to do. When we see this very unusual troop concentration going on at the Ukrainian border. Half of Europe says we should give a very strong signal to Russia that if they cross this red line, there will be very heavy consequences and a very high price to be paid. And the other half of Europe said, let's please not do anything of that kind, because that would be escalation, and what we need is de-escalation and dialogue. So the Americans and the Brits are very determined and very firm on what they want to do vis-a-vis Russia in response to this very unusual troop concentration. Europe is not. So it again shows you the limit of the geopolitical capacity of Europe. What is now our task? What Mark calls disarming connectivity. We need to manage these new threats that come from this interdependent globalized world. But at the same time, we need to keep that world open and connected as much as possible. That is what we need to do. When I had conversations for 4 years with the Trump administration, they would always say, we need to decouple China, full decoupling, cut them off from the semiconductor supply lines. Don't give any new technology to them anymore. Don't share anything. And what they already have, we should, as much as we can, disable. And my answer was always, that is not what the Netherlands government wants. Because we have the most open and globalized economy in the world. We are very dependent on integrated international supply lines and value chains, and we want to keep those. We need to manage it. We can be naive, but full decoupling is not the answer. And I'm glad to hear that's also not the answer that Mark gives. But in order to keep free trade, you need to robustly defend against unfair trade practices. In order to have an open society, you need to robustly defend against disinformation and cyber attacks. In order to keep an innovative economy, you need to defend your knowledge infrastructure, again, robustly. So this is what we need to do. We need to defend the connectivity, because it is not something that will automatically be good and profitable for you if you don't defend yourself in the meantime, and you do that robustly. I think I will stop there.
Thanks so much, Thijs. I think even more food for thought. And I think, what you're talking about, this need to balance openness and closure, connectivity, and the need, if not to disconnect, then at least to assure national populations that they can feel protected, if not be protected, and at least feel protected, I think is very important. And regarding open borders, I'll be curious to hear what our students have to say. I see there's already some questions in the chat, but I think, one of the questions, the main challenges that you're underlining is that, how can we even begin to think about developing a new EU geopolitical persona for this world if we cannot come to an agreement among ourselves? So I think, it's a kind of two-step process. So Mark, to your kind of relationship therapy, kind of metaphor, we need to be able to come into the room with the therapist together first before we start kind of thinking about who we want to be as a couple of 27. But I'll let you respond first. So Mark, over to you.
I'm very keen to. I mean, I thought Tice's remarks were brilliant, and he's shown why he's such a remarkable diplomat, because he has this very deep conceptual understanding of what's going on in the world, and it's coupled with a focus on practical things that you can do. And I sort of agreed pretty much with everything that Tice said, and some of these are also areas where we've been working very successfully with the Dutch government on, particularly on some of these questions about what robust responses in different areas might be, particularly on economic coercion, for example. And I think that what you said is really important, because if you don't find ways of standing up in a robust way for the sorts of world that you want to live in, then you'll find that robust tools get used to undermine it. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges actually to the European Union, is that it's been so convinced of the fact that history was going in our direction, and that we believed in an open world, open economies, open societies, that and that often we didn't really organize ourselves in a way that would allow those things to be protected. And we have had a very difficult period where there's been a pincer movement, both from external pushback against a lot of these ideas from other countries that don't share our priorities and our sense of how the world should be organized, and then also the lack of internal consensus behind the policies that we were producing, because we haven't done a good enough job of de-risking connectivity and interdependence for many constituents in our countries. And in the UK, we had a really big wake-up call, because 52% of people said they thought they were losing out as a result of European integration, which under any objective measure was helping Britain in the aggregate. But there were losers and winners within that aggregate gain, and enough people thought they were losers to vote against it. And I think that is something that we're experiencing in a lot of these different domains. And just before that happened, around the time that was happening, the migration crisis happened, and that led to a real shock, because many European officials, the thing they were proudest of, as Tice was saying, was about getting rid of borders within the European Union. It's a historical achievement, Schengen. And yet it was the things that we were proudest of which seemed to be hurting us the most. The same with the euro, another kind of historic achievement, but which many people felt had opened them up to risks in debtor countries, the risk of austerity and of the kind of emasculation of your domestic politics because of the way that European rules were being implemented, and in creditor countries, the risk of moral hazard and of having to bail out countries that were adopting policies which people in the creditor countries didn't necessarily approve of. And I think that has led to a very different set of discussions around European integration. Those two threats, the kind of internal threat, how do you make Europe itself safe and maintain the consent for European integration, but then also the external threat. And during COVID, in a way, the two sort of came together in a very surprising way, where I think there is this opportunity for the European Union to show European citizens that it can actually be a platform for regaining control and for defending them against the world, rather than a place which is about destroying national sovereignty. And that's the kind of the inflection point that we're at the moment, is sort of thinking very differently about the problem of sovereignty in Europe, because for most of the last few decades, the problem of sovereignty was about how do you tame sovereignty, how do you stop Europeans from killing each other by having too much sovereignty and it being too sort of violent. Whereas now I think the problem is how do you get sovereignty back from the Chinese, back from Facebook and Google and Huawei and Tencent, and people smugglers and other kinds of forces that seem to be overwhelming our states. And the EU, I think, if it gets its act together, can be part of the solution to that. And it's a very different kind of proposition.
So I'm, looking both at the questions and what you've been saying. I mean, it's really interesting because if you think about the evolution, certainly of the EU's self-representation as a geopolitical actor, I mean, starting already in the early years of European integration, so in the 1960s, there was this idea that the European community then would, quote, domesticate international relations, whether it's the work of people like Johan Galtung or François Duchesne, who are talking about civilianizing international relations and actually, kind of transferring what was good about the European project outwards, right? So not, not in the civilizational terms, but in civilian terms. And it seems, like we're working with a kind of opposite process now of protecting what is European about Europe, first of all. So this kind of, protecting the domestic sphere. And I think both Thijs, you and you, Mark, are hinting at that. So, kind of this balancing act of protecting, who we think we are, our, everything from our rule of law to, a much broader legal and regulatory and rights-based system, while at the same time, still maybe trying to somehow, extend that to the rest of the world, or have we given up on that? I mean, in terms of taming connectivity, I mean, is this regulatory domesticating function still the only kind of possibility for Europe, whether it's, combating disinformation or, somehow, thinking of, kind of taming digital infrastructure?
Sorry, do you want to go first, Thijs? Or shall I?
Yeah, remark about this, Luisa. We were talking before about what kind of world will it be? Will it be unipolar, bipolar, tripolar? Is that at all useful, these distinctions? What I think it will be, what we will see in the decades to come, is a confrontation between democracies and autocracies. It is what Biden said in his speech after 100 days to the joint session of Congress, and I thoroughly agree with that analysis. And what you see is that you have a lot of middle powers with disruptive policies. Venezuela, Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Pakistan, all these countries do stuff that we don't like. And what is the common denominator of all these countries? They're autocracies. I cannot think of a democracy in our vicinity that is that has these undermining disruptive policies that act against our interest. And then the question is, do we have this?
What about the UK?
Yeah. And then, Luisa, your question, do we still have the mission civilatrice? Every time I go to visit my counterparts in any of these countries that I just mentioned, I get speaking notes about the rule of law and about human rights. And when I'm in Saudi Arabia, I have to mention this case and that case. And when I'm in Iran, I have to mention this case. And when our minister does that too. So we will keep on doing that. Because if we wouldn't, we would betray the essence of what we are, a community of value. But we should be under no illusion that in the short term we're going to be successful in democratizing any of these countries or bringing human rights to a higher platform, because we won't. We will keep trying, but I don't think we will be very successful in spreading the model of European integration beyond our borders, because it is a unique thing that happened under unique circumstances in Europe, and we should congratulate ourselves that it has worked, because it was 75 years of peace already. But no, exporting that, it would be naive to think that we would be very successful in that.
So, I mean, I'll just jump in, Mark, before I let you get back in, because I'm looking also at the questions that are coming in. The last one from Coralie, but also others. I mean, I would fully agree with you for a variety of reasons that any idea of any pretense of a mission civilisatrice is to be abandoned. But the EU has other tools that you mentioned, that Mark mentioned, whether it's the investment screening mechanism. So it's not that, we can do things to the Saudi regime if we choose to do so, right? You're nodding.
No, exactly. And we should do that. We should have transactional relations with all these countries. And in a transactional relations, you use carrots and you use sticks to get behavior that you desire. But that is something else than trying to change these countries internally. That will be a lot less successful.
Well, I mean, in a sense, I think the term transactional is much more realistic, if not realist. Mark, I'll give the floor back to you.
I think what's been, I mean, you mentioned two things when you were talking. One is the sort of idea of trying to domesticate international relations and to translate things which we used to see as questions of power and of war and peace into much more humdrum questions about domestic politics. And then the other is this sort of more normative question about the mission civilisatrice. And both of those things seem to be going into reverse. I think, one of the things I'm trying to describe in my book is how in a whole series of different areas, the logic underlying what gets done seems to have changed. So the world doesn't look totally different to where it was, 15, 20 years ago. There's still trade deals. The United Nations exist, the World Trade Organization's there. We have supply chains, a lot of the stuff which kind of grew up around it is still there. But the way that decisions get made, I think, is according to a slightly different logic. And what you're seeing increasingly is a geopolitical takeover of areas that we thought of as more technical. And it's a bit confusing. It's one of the reasons why I think the Age of Unpeace is so dangerous, that you can get these spirals of escalation, which are so shrouded in hypocrisy and deniability that you don't actually know what's going on and you can't kind of control them. So you have a bunch of migrants on the border between Poland and Belarus, and Lukashenko can say, not very convincingly, nothing to do with me, Gov. These people who are basically looking for a better life, they thought they'd come via Belarus, not a sort of traditional route into Europe. But these things sort of happen, and then we want to sort of push back, and we introduce. We also want to push back on the way that the Russians are getting involved. So we freeze the Nord Stream pipeline for technical reasons, which have got nothing to do with the situation in Belarus, or indeed the troops being gathered on the border with Russia. You have these things which are, on the one hand, look like they are part of civilian domestic life, but which are more kind of geopolitical. It's not new. That's been happening for a long time, but Europeans are particularly awful at doing that because of this desire to domesticate foreign policy. So we do tend to put things in silos. We don't, we have NATO and we have ministries of defense that think about questions of war and peace. But, when it comes to thinking about the role of the state in the economy, in our minds, we shouldn't get involved in picking winners or in industrial strategy. The role of the state is to make sure that you can have competition and that we protect the rights of consumers and that we make sure that products are safe. And that's the kind of role that we're in. And that's a very different role to the role that the state plays in the economy, both in China, in Russia, but even in the United States, where there's more of a fusion. And where Trump will say, well, if you don't reduce your trade deficit, then we're going to withdraw troops from Germany. Your trade surplus with the US, then we're going to withdraw troops from Germany, where he's trading off between one area and another. But, there's no way that Jens Stoltenberg, when he's representing NATO, can talk to people about trade, and Ursula von der Leyen talk about where we put our troops, because it's not within her responsibility. She might be able to talk about trade. But I think in today's world, increasingly, a lot of the domestic areas of policy are being kind of weaponized and instrumentalized and are becoming more political. But at the same time, international relations is also becoming much more about domestic policy. We don't live in a world where countries don't interfere in each other's internal affairs. In fact, that's the main way that they exercise power now, by impinging on the sovereignty of others. And so that is quite a big set of changes to get to terms with. It's challenging for EU people because there's a power politics and there's a competitive spirit, which we thought we could eliminate. But it's also challenging for traditional realists who think that we live in a world of billiard balls where domestic politics doesn't matter very much and where you can actually protect countries from external interference. And that's not where we're at the moment. And until we have better ways of understanding it, is both difficult even to understand what's going on because of these kind of problems of attribution and of hypocrisy, which I was describing earlier, but also how to counter it. And we're finding, we had a kind of taster of that in the cyber realm, where people are trying to work out what is war, what isn't war, what's a threat, how do you respond, how do you escalate, how do you know who's responsible for these different types of things. But if my book's right, a lot of the questions we're asking about cyber, we increasingly have to ask it in lots of other areas to do with technology, to do with migration, to do with the management of our health systems. It's a particularly challenging thing for Europeans because we thought that interdependence was something that was good, that would make us feel more secure. And now we're realizing that it also makes us very vulnerable.
Absolutely. And I think, the parallel that you're drawing with the cyber realm, I mean, that's the first realm in which we started kind of reconsidering the very notion of territorial sovereignty, which is absurd in the digital realm, in part because, the digital world is still quite territorial with quite important, forms of territorial control. But, whether you think of precisely finance or also, the question of health. And, there is a question here about, how the EU has handled the pandemic. And we can think actually of the very, very current discussion regarding our favorite new variant, Omicron. The first gut reaction is, let's shut down the borders. Then, and it was like, oh, oops, it's already here. Right? I mean, and border closures were the first reaction, as the pandemic opens up. I mean, both internal borders, but also external borders, where, we're talk about deterritorialized airborne threats. I mean, the virus is a perfect example of that. So how do you balance that? And, and I think this, this, I don't know if it's spillage. I mean, this kind of, coming together of the domestic and the external. I mean, the kind of our set idea of states being these nice, neat containers that could be protected somehow, whether from viral or military threats, that's gone. So how do you react? Thijs, I don't know if you want to jump in.
I find that question way too complicated, so I'll leave it to Mark.
Mark.
I mean, I think it's the question really is, for me, is something that Thijs said earlier, actually. I think that we have benefited enormously from globalization and from interdependence. We've got ideas and practices and, things like the vaccines we wouldn't have had if there wasn't cooperation across borders. But at the same time, these sorts of things create vulnerabilities, they create winners and losers. So the challenge really is to look quite hard at all of these different relationships and to try and organize them in ways that that make them less risky. And sometimes it will mean decoupling selectively in some areas. Sometimes it actually means more coupling. Thijs mentioned the migration crisis is a big sort of success of European foreign policy. For me, the biggest single success of European foreign policy over the last 2 decades has been our energy policies. 15 years ago, people talked about how Russia was using gas as a weapon against European countries. And what we've managed to do is to do what you talked about, to kind of trivialize the gas relationship in many ways. It was a threat, not because we were consuming Russian gas, but because some countries didn't have any other choices and any other options, and they weren't very big markets for the Soviet Union, for Russia, which meant that they were very easy to cut off, particularly Baltic states, which had. So you had this kind of strange situation where we were wrong to think the problem was that we were consuming Russian gas, because you have the biggest consumer of Russian gas is Germany, which is a huge market, but has a very diversified gas market. So it actually could do without Russian gas without being plunged in a crisis. And it would in fact hurt Russia much more than it would hurt Germany if the Russian-German gas trade stopped tomorrow. So therefore, the power in that relationship, even though Germany was buying more Russian gas than everyone else, the power was all in Berlin rather than in Moscow. Whereas in other countries like Estonia, they were 115% dependent on Russian gas, because they both used Russian gas for all of their own energy needs, and then they exported some more, which meant that they were, and it's a tiny market, so it was very cheap for the Russians to cut them off and to use it as a political weapon. The solution wasn't to stop buying Russian gas, but it was to reorganize our markets so that we used the tools of the internal market to decouple, to make sure that we dealt with competition policy, that people were not, the same people weren't controlling the pipelines as kind of selling the energy on it. And we also linked up these energy islands that didn't have any other choices, so that they could be connected to electricity grids. They could get reverse flow from other countries. Power stations, which were just gas power stations, were turned into dual use ones, so you could use more fungible fuels on them. And as a result, energy is no longer the sort of brilliant weapon that it was 15 years ago. I mean, it hasn't totally disappeared as a source of influence for Russia, but it's much less dangerous as a political threat to European countries from where we were before. And that is, I think, came about from thinking in a smart way about how we organize our relationships. And I think it's a model for what we can do in lots of other areas.
Which is, I think, a great example of, kind of the disarming some of these, threats. So I guess the question actually to both of you, I mean, I'm looking at one of the first questions we received regarding here specifically the role of Oceania, but the role of alliances, right? I mean, Mark, in your book, you trace these four worlds. But of course, I mean, apart from, the autocrats that, as Thijs was saying, perhaps we should use other measures with. I mean, should the EU, as part of its, kind of attempt to disarm connectivity or rearm it in different ways, seek these strategic alliances in different sectors, whether it's energy or anywhere else?
Shall I say something on that?
Yeah,
when does an alliance work best? It is when the countries that are in the alliance share two things: values and interests. That is why NATO is such a success, because we share values and interest. And the same thing is more or less true for the EU. Although sometimes nowadays the values are under threat, and that is hugely threatening to the essence of our project. But that is when an alliance works. An alliance that is where you don't share values with your partner, ultimately it's not going to work very well. And the same thing if you have values that you share but no interest. It's a combination that is the winner for a durable alliance. Now, I think, for instance, the Indo-Pacific strategy of the EU is very important, because what we need to do is spin a web of alliances in the Indo-Pacific with countries with which we share values and interests. With China, for at least a half century to come. We will not share values. It's not going to happen because of what they're doing in Xinjiang. Our national parliament has labeled what China is doing in Xinjiang as a genocide. Well, you can never share values with a country that your parliament thinks commits genocide. But there's other countries in the Indo-Pacific where we do share values and interests. And that is South Korea, that is Japan, that is Australia, that is New Zealand, that is Indonesia, that is, and we need to work very closely with those countries.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think Thijs made the point very well. So I have to...
You'll leave it at that. I mean, I find it a very, a much more complicated task, certainly, than the one we thought we had in the early 2000s, which seems really strange. I mean, those were, again, the years of the War on Terror, where there was a fundamental, not only transatlantic break, but also a very important break within Europe itself, right? Among EU states. And yet the task ahead, I mean, the kind of optimism, Mark, that you described in your book then seemed easier. Maybe, I mean, I think it was in many ways an illusion also based on shaping the world to somehow, reflect our values and interests, Thijs, as you're saying. So is it, and back to your kind of self-help analogy, end of the illusion?
I think there was an illusion back then because, we had been, as Europeans, obviously we have been the center of the world for a few hundred years since the Enlightenment, but mainly since the Industrial Revolution and imperialism in the 19th century, when Europeans were basically carving up large chunks of the world and moving people around and changing things in quite fundamental ways, imposing their will on other players. And that obviously ate itself out. So by the end of the Second World War, we were no longer the kind of most powerful countries in the world, but we were at the front line in the Cold War. And both the Soviet Union and the United States of America were sort of European powers culturally anyway, in terms of how they thought about themselves and they're sort of both the kind of communist project and the sort of capitalist counter project in the US were projects that had their roots in the Enlightenment and in Europe as well. And I think what we're facing now is obviously a much more post-European world, where it's not just that power has become more multipolar, but ideas have become more multipolar as well. And increasingly, people are defining themselves against European ideas and against American ideas, as much as trying to follow them and aspiring to follow them. I think maybe part of the illusion that we had 15, 20 years ago was that the dominance of our ideas was a product of their attractiveness and of our soft power. Whereas in fact, I think it probably had a lot more to do with our hard power, the fact that we had conquered all these countries, set up education systems in our image, and American bases were all over the world, and we had won the Cold War. These are all persuasive things. As power shift, as hard power kind of shifts away from us, then I think you find that our soft power and ideas are more contested. And we're going from a period which was a more kind of missionary period where we thought we could change different people. And I think in Europe, we overinterpreted the significance of the return to Europe, which a lot of Eastern and Central European countries went through, where they felt that they were, realizing their dreams of self-determination was about rejoining the European project. And we saw this incredible shift, involving tens of millions of people across the continent, and somehow thought that was a global phenomenon rather than just something which was a product of particular historical circumstances of people who felt that they'd been denied their path and they saw neighboring countries go down a different route and wanting to rejoin it. So I think that was overinterpreted, as well as the kind of attractiveness of these ideas. I think a lot of these ideas, one of the reasons they were attractive was because they were underpinned by hard power. So when the hard power kind of disappears, maybe some of the soft power disappears. So we're now entering a period which is much more about self-determination and about decolonization, rather than the end of history where people are following Western ideas. And that's a much more challenging environment for us. And does mean, I think what Thijs was saying, that from a European perspective, it's more about celebrating and recognizing European exceptionalism rather than seeing Europe as a sort of missionary project which other people were going to follow to and reshape their societies around.
Which is perhaps not necessarily a bad thing. Thijs?
Yeah, just one addition to what I just said. Of course, long-lasting alliances, you share values and interests, but that does not mean we shouldn't engage in other coalitions as Europe, because we should. And I'll give one example. Take the countries of the Maghreb, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. These are three countries that are immensely important for us. Why? Because they are in between us and the countries of the Sahel. And the countries of the Sahel, it's a very dangerous and Hobbesian world with civil strife, with armed terrorist group gaining territory. They're hotbeds of irregular migration, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, terrorism, you name it. And above that, between us and those countries, we have these three relatively stable countries. It is in our best interest that they remain stable, and it is in our best interest to make sure the governments of these three countries can supply their citizens with the services they need, so those countries will remain stable. Because of those countries, and right now the trouble in the Sahel is trickling south to the coastal states that become destabilized because of what is happening in Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso. Imagine what would happen if those troubles trickle north and those three countries become destabilized. We would have a very big problem right at our doorstep. So we should do everything we can to help Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia deal with the challenges that they have. We should stand by their side without having the illusions that we will turn those countries into Denmark, because we won't. It will be a long time before they embrace the values that we embrace in the European Union. But we do need coalitions with these countries, and I can name a host of other ones where we need to do that, because it is simply in our best interest.
So it's really, here you're talking about key countries in what was and is the European neighborhood policy. Just admitting that our primary concern is securitization and stabilization of the region without this, mission civilisatrice of also, building, as Prodi called it, the ring of friends, and democratizing and transforming these countries. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah. My time is running up.
Our time is actually running up. And I'm sure, we had still more questions. I'm sure we could go on. Thank you both very much. I mean, as an incurable Euro optimist, I would like to see, a light at the end of this. I think perhaps, Mark, to go back once more to your therapy metaphors, maybe being realistic about what the EU can do and starting from there without the grand, illusions and hubris of transforming the world. That's not a bad thing to let go of. I would perhaps still keep the impetus to democratization, to the protection of human rights, all the things that we have been that define Europe for what it is. So I will take the chair's prerogative to end it at that. Thank you once more, both of you, very much. Thanks to our audience who stuck with us on this Wednesday evening and those listening on YouTube. And for those of you who didn't watch the whole thing, the recording will be available immediately. Thanks again.